Welcome back. In this video, we'll pick up where we left off in the last video using the docker pull and docker container run commands and launch a web server in a Docker container. Before we pull an image from Docker Hub, I'll just do a little cleanup on my local machine. We can see the result of running a docker container ls-a that I don't have any containers on my dev machine. And running a docker image ls shows I have two versions of the Ubuntu image. Now, I want to go ahead and delete those images. And previously, I showed you that we can delete the images by executing a docker rmi command followed by the image ID. Well, if we want to remove multiple images in one command, we could chain those together. But we can also use the abbreviated IDs as previously discussed. So this command would work as well. However, if you have several images that you want to delete, chaining all these together can be a little tedious. So there is a command that we can execute which will remove all images in one go. And that's the docker image prune command passing -a. And when we execute this, it'll prompt us to make sure that we want to continue and prune those images. And if we say yes, we'll see that it's removed both tagged versions of Ubuntu. And if we do a docker image ls again, we see we no longer have any images. Now, let's jump over to Docker Hub and search for the Apache HTTPD web server image. And this is the image we'll use to spin up an Apache HTTPD server in a Docker container. So we'll copy the command to pull the image, jump back into our terminal, paste, and execute. And if we do a docker image ls, we'll see we have the latest tagged version of HTTPD. Alright, so let's go ahead and use that HTTPD image and start up a container running the Apache Web Server. So we'll execute docker container run and give the container a name of web server 01 using the HTTPD image. We execute that, and we see the HTTPD is running in the foreground. Now, HTTPD runs on port 80. So let's go ahead and try and access port 80 on localhost. And we get a message that this site can't be reached. Well, that's because I'm trying to access the web server on port 80 on my local host, which is my Mac. But the web server is running on localhost inside of the container. So let's see how we can try and access the home page being served by Apache server inside of the Docker container. So in my terminal, I'm going to open another tab. And if I do a docker ps, this will show me the running containers. And we see we have our HTTPD image launched in a container named web server 01. Now, what I want to do is execute a command that will allow me to execute commands inside of this Docker container. So I want to attach to the container so that I can execute commands inside of it. So in order to do that, I'll use the docker container exec command, passing the flag so I have an interactive terminal. I want to execute this against the web server 01 container. And the command that I want to execute is bin bash to run a bash shell. So if I hit enter, now I'm inside of the web server 01 container logged in as root. Now let's see if we have curl installed. And we don't. So let's see what operating system we're running. And we could do that running cat against etc os release and grepping for name. And now we have our operating system. So to install curl, we need to execute apt update and apt upgrade. And then we can run apt install curl. Now let's check the curl version just to make sure it's installed. Okay, now if all goes well, we should be able to curl localhost on port 80, and we get the response back of an HTML page with a h1 element that says it works. So that's a response from the web server running inside the Docker container that we're attached to executing commands through docker exec. Now, that's all well and good that we can connect to our Docker container and execute a curl command to get the response from the web server, but that's not really going to help us exposing our website to the outside world. So let's go ahead and stop that running container, and we could do that using a docker container stop command, passing it the container ID. And if we do a docker ps again, we'll see the container stopped. And if we jump back in the other tab, we see that the container has shut down. So remember, when we launched that container, we gave it a name of Web Server 01. So if we run this container again, because we haven't deleted it, even though it's been terminated, we're going to need to change the name to Web Server 02. We still want to use the HTTPD image, but now we need a way to expose the port, which is 80, running inside of the Docker container on our host, which in my case is the Mac OS. And the way I could do that is by passing the -t flag and then specifying the port that I want to access the web server running in the container on from my host. So port 80 on my Mac, on my local host, I want to map to port 80 in the container. And actually, just to show the difference here, I'll map port 8080 on my Mac to port 80 inside the container. So let's go ahead and run this now. And we have a new instance of the HTTPD image up and running in a Docker container named Web Server 02. Now, if we go back to the browser and try and access localhost on port 80, we still get the site can't be reached. Now, the web server is running on port 80 inside of the container. But remember, we mapped port 8080 on the host to port 80 in the container. So if I try to go to localhost 8080, now we get a response back from the web server running on port 80 in the Docker container. So the way that we expose the application running inside the Docker container is to map the port from the host OS to the port in the Docker container. So that's what I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, we'll take a deeper dive into Docker images.